Good evening to everyone. Actually, for those who have joined since, I've posted a link on the chat to the handout. So those who are live have the handout. Those who are online, I've posted a link to the handout, and I'll put the link also in the bottom of the YouTube recording for those listening online. Okay, so today's share, I'm afraid, is dealing with very, very difficult matters. In the last few weeks, we've looked at other aspects of ethics of war and morals of war. We've looked at the besieging and collective punishments, civilian casualties, and the like. This time, we're going to spend some of our time looking at the very fraught issue of hostages and negotiating hostage release. And then we'll look at what's equally a very, very difficult topic, which is conditional divorce in halacha, and a suggestion that chayalim, soldiers, before they go to war, should engage in conditional divorce, which is a little bit of a hot topic at the moment in Israel. Both very, very, very painful topics. I was hesitant speaking about these matters because they're so painful, but they are now. Originally, I decided actually not to speak about hostages because obviously this is private tragedy for each family and individual affected, and obviously a collective trauma for Klal Yisrael. But I made the decision to speak about it, given that the debates are now taking place in Israel and around the world, and I think we're all worrying and wondering about the balance that needs to be found. So I am going to speak about hostage and hostage negotiation, and also the painful issue of conditional divorces for soldiers who are going out to battle. And again, since these are being discussed and are currently a matter of dispute in Israel. So the dilemma is an old one. In classic sources, it was not spoken about in terms of hostages, but it was pidyon shvurim, redemption of captives. And the mitzvah of pidyon shvurim is a very great one. The idea of redeeming a captive, someone who's been unfairly imprisoned, is a very important mitzvah. And we can look briefly in source 1, a Gemara in Baba Basra. Omar Rabbi Yochanan, quotes a pasuk that captivity is the worst fate of all. Cherev kosher mimoves, being killed is worse than death. Rav kosher mecherev, dying of starvation is worse than direct being killed. Shevi kosher mekolom, but captivity is the worst fate. Is awful. The Rambam in source 2, really citing the Gemara, says that pidyon shvurim kodem la. Someone asked if I can turn my microphone up on the chat. I don't think I know how to do that. So again, can someone online just indicate to me that they are able to hear me? If someone's able just online to confirm that. Don't know if anyone's able to hear me. Yeah, you can. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So it may just be the person who posted that. Okay. So the Rambam says in source 2, pidyon shvurim kodem la panosas aniyim. He says that pidyon shvurim comes first, is the greatest priority of tzedakah. It comes ahead even of feeding those who are poor and clothing them. The ein mitzvah gedolah b'pidyon shvurim. He says there's no greater mitzvah than pidyon shvurim. Shavai, someone who's captive, Haru Bichlal, Arevim, Vatzmeim, they are hungry, they are thirsty, Arumim, they are unclothed, they're at risk of their lives, etc. So the Rambam says there's no mitzvah greater than this. Pidyon shvurim is an exceptionally great mitzvah. Now, and just I suppose for one more source, the Shulchan Aruch in source 3. Any delay in freeing captives, where one can free them more swiftly, is as if one's murdering. They're at risk. Every moment that a captive is at risk, they are vulnerable. They're over threats for their lives. So these are some of the classic sources over the concept of pidyon shvurim. And again, for I see some people, those who have come online, I'll just post the link to the talk for those who haven't managed to see the handout. Now, in the past, pidyon shvurim was not a hostage situation like nowadays, and it wasn't a national debate like nowadays. There was no state of Israel. These were individual and communal discussions. What do we do about someone who has been kidnapped or held captive, either by pirates? The Mediterranean was rife with piracy, and Jews, along with other travelers in the Mediterranean, would be captured and sold on the slave markets of the Middle East and elsewhere, or captives held because of a direct anti-Semitic motive. So rather than it being general piracy on the Mediterranean, captives held by kings who held them for ransom and saw this as a money-making need for their, a way of making money for their treasury. Now, a famous source that discusses this, source 4, is the Mishnah and Gemara in Gittin. And the Mishnah says, Ein poidin es hashavuin, yes al kadei demeyan. We don't pay over the market value, over their price, because of tikkun ha'olam, because of fixing of the world. So when you redeem a captive, don't overpay for redeeming a captive because of tikkun ha'olam, because of repairing the world. What does this mean, repairing the world? What's the reason for this? Why is it dangerous to overpay for a captive? So the Gemara says, the Gemara asks a question. This tikkun ha'olam that we're talking about, mishum duchka de sibura, is it because of pressure on the community? Or is it so that they don't get tempted to capture more people? So the first explanation is a rule made, don't overpay for captives, because otherwise this will become an unbearable burden on the community. And therefore, sadly, even though there's no greater mitzvah than pidyon shavuim, redeeming captives, and no greater distress than to be a captive, nonetheless, there's a limit to what the community can pay for. The alternative explanation in the Gemara is that if we redeem captives over their market value, we simply tempt the captors, the pirates, the emperors and kings that choose to imprison Jews, to seize more Jews, because they see this as a valuable market, a valuable resource, and therefore it doesn't make sense to overpay for Jews. This is the classic sources that we have. Now, there's a number of questions that emerge over this Gemara. First of all, which reason is the authoritative halachic reason? Secondly, does this apply in a situation where a captive is in actual danger, where there's a threat to kill a captive, or merely where the captive is held in captivity, which obviously is risking their lives? Does this Gemara forbid, or Mishnah forbid, the redemption of captives, or simply say we're not obligated to do so? There's a limit on our obligation, but if we wish to, we can so choose. And are there any exceptions to the rule? Am I allowed to redeem myself for above the market value? Am I allowed to redeem a relative for above the market value? And more than that, what exactly do we mean by Yosem Mikadei Dameya, more than their value? Exactly how do we define value? So define value, and what are the reasons for this? How do we paskin it in the Gemara? So the difference between the two reasons that the Gemara gives, the first reason the Gemara gives is so as not to impose a burden on the community. That would seem to imply that if someone wishes to redeem themselves, or I wish to redeem a friend or a family member, and I'm not going to the community to ask for communal funds, I wish to do it myself, then seemingly one would be able to do so. Whereas the second reason, which says that we don't want to establish a precedent of Jews being willing to pay above market value, would mean precluding even perhaps redeeming friends and family, even if I'm blessed with great wealth and therefore wish to do so, and I'm not imposing a burden on the community. Nonetheless, I'm prohibited to do so, so as not to create a long-term problem. How do we define value? So there's a number of suggestions put forth. It may be that value means on the slave market. So unfortunately, there used to be, and actually today, still to this day, there is nowadays a black economy, a hidden economy, an illegal economy, but there is a trade in human beings, seeing them as capital, as a monetary object. So the first suggestion is the Gemara is saying, don't redeem above the value of the person on the slave market. In other words, unfortunately, we live in a world where Jew and non-Jew humans are going to be captured by pirates and sold on the slave market. Jews can pay the going rate as per market forces to redeem their brothers and sisters, but shouldn't overpay above the market value. That's one way of understanding the Gemara. Again, in that case, it would be difficult to know how to apply this ruling, if at all, to nowadays. And again, we're not yet really considering nowadays. We're simply looking at the classic sources. A second explanation might be, don't pay beyond what's charged for other captives. In other words, there's an economy, unfortunately, of holding people to ransom. Again, we have this in perhaps Mexican drug cartels and the like, where unfortunately there's a sort of economy of a ransom. And again, what it's saying is don't overpay beyond what the going rate is of cartels and kidnappers who are engaging in kidnapping to make money. In there, the logic would be, again, don't overpay so that Jews aren't selectively targeted because they know the Jewish community would overpay. So again, not necessarily applicable or easily applicable in today's day and age, but these are some of the different ways of measuring it. There's a third idea, perhaps it means don't overpay beyond the resources. So don't overstretch the community or the individual's resources. And it means contextualize it. So each scenario, work out what's affordable, but don't overpay and force the community to overstretch itself and risk impoverishing the members of the community. So these are some of the ideas behind not overpaying. If we look, for example, I printed in source 5 the language of the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll come back to later. The Shulchan Aruch says in source 5, Ein poiden hashvuin, yos miktei demeim. We don't pay more than the going rate, because of fixing the world. So that people don't dedicate themselves to kidnapping Jews. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that reason. He says the primary reason is so that Jews don't get targeted as victims. And then he says, a person can redeem themselves for whatever sum of money they want. In other words, there's a limit how far you can apply this law. It's true that we as a community have a communal responsibility not to redeem people and create problems to create a societal trend of kidnapping Jews. But an individual, we can't expect of an individual not to free themselves. Why should they sacrifice their own liberty for that? And therefore, a person would be allowed to free themselves. In source 6, we have an applicability to very close relatives, the spouse. We don't require a husband to redeem his wife more than her value. But whatever is the going rate for shar shavuyot, this language seems to imply that there's unfortunately, tragically, a going ransom rate. Don't overpay beyond the going ransom rate. On that, the Ramah says, a wife is like oneself. In other words, that degree, spousal responsibility is different to responsibility to everyone else. And with spousal responsibility also, one can redeem above the going rate because I don't have to sacrifice for societal needs, my own self-interest to that degree. So these are some of the classic sources around this. Very famously, the Maram Mirottenberg, so this is a story that dates back 800 years ago. The Maram Mirottenberg was really the Gadol Hadar at the time. He was the primary halachic authority in the Ashkenazi world in Germany. And without going into the full setting, the German emperor at the time was determined to reduce the Jewish community to serf-like status, where they were attached to a particular piece of land and weren't able to travel freely. The Maram Mirottenberg tried to flee and was caught and handed back to the Emperor Rudolf and imprisoned. And according to some sources, the community wished to ransom him, and he instructed them, perhaps via his student, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher, the famous halachic posek, the Rosh, not to allow his ransom, so as not to establish a precedent in which no rabbi would be safe, and which any communal rabbi was vulnerable to kidnapping in order to blackmail the community to free him. So it's a very famous incident recorded in some sources. This seems to be an accurate story, even though some question the reliability of this, because the Rosh himself says that an exception can be made for a great leader. In other words, it is true that damage is done by ransoming captives at above the going rate. But if this person is an exceptional leader, a Gadol Hadar, who's a posek of outstanding ability where the whole of Klal Yisrael needs them, how can we deprive the whole Jewish people of this person's leadership by their sensibilities of not wanting to be redeemed? The Marshal says, Marshal was we're talking about a couple of hundred years after this story took place, he said, how can this story be true? The Maharam Rothenberg was a great leader, he understood his worth, and he should have allowed himself to be redeemed. Nonetheless, this ducal kidnapping, it was Duke, not an emperor, I'm sorry, ducal kidnapping seems to be an accurate record of fact, and that the Maharam Rothenberg refused redemption. After he died, it seems that there were negotiations, and his body was released for burial upon the paying of a large sum of money. And whether he would have agreed to that or would have disagreed to that and said that he didn't want his body either to be redeemed for the same reasons are a little unclear, or perhaps because enough time had passed, over a decade passed before this took place, and therefore maybe the same fear wasn't there. Either way, we do have the grave of the Maharam Rothenberg still in existence, and next to it is the grave of the person who redeemed his body, who spent a large sum of money to redeem him. So this was a sort of halachic discussion at that time in history. At the time of Russian kidnapping of Cantonists, again, there were, and Russian persecutions, there was considerable halachic debate about ransoming captives at the time. This is something that sort of sadly and tragically flared up in Jewish history on many occasions. There is a Gemara in Gittin, which is a difficult source, and this is source 7 in the middle of page 1, in which the Gemara brings a story. Maisa Tanu Rabbanon, we've learned. Maisa Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Shahalach lekrach gadol shebromi. So Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, who came from the very provincial Eretz Yisrael, journeyed to the capital of Rome. And Omrulo, he said, Tinuk echad yesh bebeis hasurim. There is a prisoner in the prison, Yochei Inaim, of beautiful eyes, with very beautiful experience, Gavots of Sadiris, Lotal Talim, has locks of hair. The story is perhaps presented because this particular prisoner was vulnerable, was being held for immoral purposes, this young boy, or some other reason. But either way, he's told about, tragically, this beautiful young kid who's held in prison. Now, Rabbi Shua ben Chananya engages in psukim of discourse with this boy. So he stands at the gates of the prison, and he calls out a pasuk in Yeshaya to this young man, perhaps trying to check whether he's genuinely a Jewish prisoner or not, where he comes from. So it's a way of sort of engaging conversation. He calls out pasuk, Omad halach v'omad, this is the second line of the source, halach v'omad al Pesach beis hasurim. He stood at the entrance of the prison, and he calls to the bars, Aman, he quotes the pasuk in Yeshaya, min losin of Shisa Yaakov Yisrael avozim, and the boy replies, etc. Let's jump to the final line of source 7. Omru, so they said, or let's go to the penultimate line. He said, Omar, he says, Muftachani, I'm sure that Shemora Harav Yisrael, that this kid is going to grow up to become a great Talmud Chacham. He already knows, he's there in prison in Rome, and he knows his Tanakh off by heart. Havoda, I promise in the name of God, She'eni Zoz Mikan, I'm not going to leave here, Ad She'eftenu, until I redeem him, B'chol Momon She'poskin Alai, with whatever sum they demand of me. Omenu Zoz Mishamat She'paturu B'Momon Haber. He didn't leave till he paid a great sum of money. So we basically have a Gemara in Gittin, in which Rabbi Shua ben Chanina seems to ignore the rule of not overpaying for captives, and he overpays for this boy. So what's going on over here? How does this fit the halachic source? So there's 3 answers really given to this question. Either because he saw that this child was exceptional, was going to grow up and become a great leader, and therefore, as we saw already, a godol, a great figure, can be redeemed over their price, or because he realized this child was at risk of death, in which case we have a source that the whole halacha, which says we don't redeem captives over their price, is where they're not at risk of execution. But if they're at risk of execution, we can free them. It's true that Pidyon Shavurim is dangerous for the captive. We saw in the early sources it's the worst form of death. That means in the long run, tragically, it's not going to end well for the captive. But if there's an immediate threat of death, of course you can redeem the captive even for above their value, because they're in danger now. Pikuach nefesh trumps everything. And the third explanation given in this is that in this case over here, there is no fear of inciting extra captives to take place. The Romans have waged war. They're capturing whoever they can capture. The war is over. Rome is somewhat a civilized state. It's not just randomly capturing people, and therefore they're not going to be encouraged to capture more Jews in order to increase ransom fees. The Romans don't do that. They run an ordered empire. It's true they capture Jews at the time of the battle, but now that the battle's over, they're not just kidnapping random Jews and selling them on the slave markets of Rome, and therefore there isn't a risk by over-redeeming and generating future challenges. Yeah.
The risk of death, is that a physical death or spiritual?
Not entirely clear, and it's in general a broader question. Do the halachas of pikuach nefesh, we know we can break almost any mitzvah to avoid physical death, does that also extend to spiritual death? Can I be mechalel Shabbos to save someone from being baptized, that sort of thing? So this is an interesting halachic question. There are a number of sources that speak about this. The Mishnah Berurah is of the view, more or less, that one cannot transgress an Issur Torah in order to save someone from spiritual death. The Chai Odom seems to say that one can. There's a tradition in the family of the Soloveitchik family, of Chaim Soloveitchik. Chaim Soloveitchik held that spiritual death is also enough to save life. So it remains a little bit of a complicated figure, this topic. But starting with physical death, according to this answer, Pidyon Shvurim would be allowed even at excessive sums, because there's someone in front of one who's in actual danger. In source 8, I printed some, or maybe let me just summarize before we look at source 8. So basically, what we've seen so far is a Mishnah which tells us not to overspend on redeeming, where overspending needs a little bit of definition. We've seen that the Shulchan Aruch paskins that the main reason isn't just so as to avoid imposing an unbearable burden on the community, but is to avoid precedents and therefore encouraging future kidnapping. And we've seen possible exceptions to the rule, such as a situation of danger, a great figure who might be an exception of Godel, like the Maram Rothenberg maybe, someone redeeming themselves or their spouse because they're entitled to do so, and in a case where perhaps the reason doesn't apply, like it wouldn't generate more kidnappings because war has passed and Rome isn't now just going to go randomly around and kidnapping people. And these sorts of explanations are reflected through the generations in different halachic sources that discuss these exceptions. What I want to do now is look at a few more recent teshuvos that deal with the applicability of some of these topics to modern scenarios, and then just pause and think about some sort of final thoughts around the current situation, and then we'll go on to the second part of the share. So in source 8, there's a very, very interesting teshuvah from Rabbi Zobin Yosef, who for many decades was not just the chief rabbi of Israel, but the senior halachic authority, and he discusses raids on Entebbe. This is source 8. I printed this when, unfortunately, we know a whole aeroplane was held hostage, and the debate was about saving 100 Jews on the plane, and there was discussion about releasing Arab and Palestinian prisoners. That was the initial demands of the terrorists. And let's just have a quick look at Rabbi Zobin Yosef's words. Whether one can save the hundreds of Jews from their captors, tumurat, in return for shechrur shel elah, for the release of Arab prisoners. However, yesh lochash rak b'mikri, yesh lochash, we should be afraid, shenosaf kamhu al sarenu. Maybe the prisoners being released will be added to our enemies. And they will go on and become attackers themselves. And he says, a possibility doesn't take away from a definite. Some of the prisoners released may sadly go on and become future attackers of the Jewish people. Some may not. However, we now have 100 people there in Entebbe in immediate danger. They're in immediate danger, and therefore you have to weigh up doubt against certainty. This was Rabbi Zobin Yosef's view. He then says, we gathered together, the leaders of the generation gathered, and whilst we were in the midst of gathering this, Yitzchak Rabin turned up at our meeting. We now know that Yitzhak Rabin was interested in a halachic view on the matter, and he said, in the meantime, I've taken the decision to send in a rescue team, and therefore the rabbinic discourse, in a sense, was disbanded. Sorry? It wasn't needed, yes, yeah. A list later was published by Rabbi Yosef of who he included in this meeting: Rav Elyashiv, Rav Oibach, Rav Zolti, Rav Shol Yisraeli, who I've mentioned in previous year and will mention again, very important posik in these areas, Rav Zion Abba Shol and others. In the end, it became unnecessary. Interestingly, in that conversation, Rabbi Vadi Yosef asked, not in a later story, the story of Gilad Shalit. When Rabbi Yosef was asked, he came to a similar conclusion that Gilad Shalit was in immediate danger, and therefore it was worth redeeming him using captives. And at the time in prison was a particular terrorist who had himself attacked Rabbi Vadia and tried to murder him in Tovshin Samach Daled. So we're looking 20 years ago now. In I think 2003 must have been 2002, 2003. 2004. I'm sorry, it's 2004. And Rabbi Vadia said, in order not to be deemed a hypocrite, if you follow my Pesach, I request that he should be one of the prisoners released, so that I'm personally, in a sense, affected by my very attacker should be released. So these are some of the classic sources around the concept of redeeming hostages. What I want to do now is look at modern sources that claim that these classic sources are not really directly relevant to any of these modern scenarios. And they raise a number of important distinctions. Good evening. Sorry, were you in the other room waiting, or are you in? Fine, okay. Yeah, I know, Tuesday night. I'm sorry. Yeah, take a source sheet. I apologize for shifting to the wrong night. Okay, so and the broad category of the point they all make, we're looking at redeeming hostages, is that equations shift when you're looking on a national level and a war footing to private scenarios. And the Gemara and the Mishnah and all the classic sources were talking about individuals or communities freeing others. They weren't talking about a nation state at war that has to make decisions. And they say in that context, you have to look at war aims, you have to look at national morale, you have to look at soldiers who can only go to battle if they know that everything will be done by the country to try and free them. You have to look at a national aim of people being able to live on the periphery of the country, which are more vulnerable, and knowing the state will do everything for them. We can't afford to have people scared to live in the south or the north because of vulnerability. We have to, on the other hand, look at not making ourselves vulnerable to be able to carry out war aims and always be held hostage. In other words, a nation can't say we're not going to engage in warfare because we can't risk our hostages being hurt. That cripples the ability of a nation to function and engage in warfare. And we have to take into account, if we're releasing terrorists, will these terrorists go on and attack back? And therefore you have to look at a broader picture. Indeed, we know that Yachar Sinha, the one of the terrorists who was released for Gilad Shalit, is of course the mastermind behind Hamas's recent attacks. Again, I want to emphasize, it's very easy sitting here pontificating in the comfort of Hemden, and I'm not talking in the least about decisions that were made then or decisions that are being made now. These are very, very painful and difficult decisions that the government has to make. But nonetheless, these are some of the points that are mentioned. And what I'd like to do is just look very briefly at some of the sources that discuss this. By now, hopefully, some of these sources are familiar to us from previous weeks when we looked at the difference between personal decisions and warfare. The first is from Rabbi Shol Yisraeli, whose teshuvas we looked at extensively when we were looking at the morals of warfare. And he says, Din Melchamet Mitzvah be'ezras Yisrael, a Melchamet Mitzvah to save the Jewish people miyad from an enemy, who lo rak b'Klal Yisrael nosim b'sakona. It's not just when the whole Jewish nation is in danger. Elegam shemeduba al iriyat Yisrael be'detet, even when it's against one city. Shkolachon mitzvah lo v'lesakin atzmam manas b'hatzel. Everyone has to endanger themselves, even to save a group of people. War doesn't just mean that the whole nation is in danger. Then Rav Yehuda Henkin says, "Ein mashkichem b'sakona livnei arava." We can't take into account, this is, source 10 at the top of page 2. We can't take into account, he says, the danger of the hostages in a decision about whether to wage war. In all warfare, we don't consider individual danger. Let me just remind you of what we discussed in previous weeks. Normally speaking, no mitzvah trumps danger to life. So I don't have to keep Shabbos at the expense of loss of my life. I don't have to keep the halachas of Shabbos at the expense of halachas life. I can eat non-kosher food to save my life. I don't have to eat matzah and do the positive mitzvah of eating matzah if it will risk my life. Asks the Minchas Chinuch and the Brisker and many others, how can there be a mitzvah to wage war? Every war involves the risk of life of the soldiers. And the answer is that war evidently is different. It switches to national equation rather than private equation, and we discussed this extensively in previous weeks. So as Rav Henkin, based on that, the same logic would dictate that even at the risk of life to hostages, a nation, Israel, is entitled to wage war, even though tragically that risks the lives of its hostages, because it has to look at the bigger picture and it has to look at the war aims if that's what's appropriate to be taken into account. In source 11, Rabbi Yisraeli says he believes there's almost a contractual obligation, a social contract, in which a country promises to do everything to rescue its soldiers. Soldiers are different because we're asking soldiers to risk their lives, and the quid pro quo of that is that we'll do everything to redeem them. Source 11, we'll just have a look at the beginning of source 11. Nira, he says, from this perspective, we have to see the obligation of the country to save its soldiers. They went out as agents of the states or mitama on its behalf, the Hagana to to protect the people living in Zion. There's an unwritten social contract to, in return, save them. Okay, so what we've seen basically is a range of sources that say you need to look on a national level, not on a private level, when it comes to hostage redemption in national issues. And we can't use the formulae of Tikkun Olam and other things which we inherited from the Mishnah and the Gemara, which were talking about private affairs. And we have to look on a national level. On one side, you have national morale, soldiers' morale, national interests to maintain, to defend the periphery, and so on. On the other side, you have national interests and needing to be able to wage war and not be vulnerable that a war can't be waged whenever one individual is attacked, and national interests not to risk perhaps danger to the state by releasing people who might prove to be dangerous to the country in the future and the like. So you have to weigh up these sort of competing equations. And we saw in previous weeks that the Meiri and others believe that the country is entitled to appoint delegates to make national decisions in the interests of the country, and they are somewhat equivalent to the Melech. They have an executive role akin to Dinah de Malchus Dinah. And in the context there for the modern state of Israel, this would be the elected government of Israel, who, as long as they're behaving in a moral and ethical way, are entitled to weigh up these sorts of dilemmas and try and balance the military needs of Israel with the morale of the nation and other such factors. And this is a legitimate decision for them to take. So just to summarize, we saw classic sources that speak about not encouraging the capture of Jews or not imposing an unbearable burden on the community. We saw exceptions to that rule when there's risk of life, and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef applied a similar sort of formula to the Entebbe scenario. And then we saw sources like Rabbi Henkin and Rabbi Yisraeli and others who say this is a mistake, this is a situation of war, a different equation needs to be used. The final source that I printed in this part of the discussion comes from Rav Hershel Schachter, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, in his beautiful work, Be'ikvei HaTzon. And it's just interesting because of a little bit of history. In the year Tofshin Lamed, so we're talking about 54 years ago, there was a range of hijacking that took place, hijacking of aeroplanes. Yes, the Black September, that horrible group. And sorry? Yes. And there was actually several of them. 3 here in the shul. We actually have John. I think Danneman spoke a while back about his pet. One of his parents were in this. And Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner was in this. And one of Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner's students, he was a Rosh Yeshiva, approached various Gedolim in America, asking whether it would be appropriate for him to offer the hijackers $1 million to release Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner, to enter into private negotiation with the hijackers. And it became a bit of a debate around Pidyon Shavuim and these classic sources. And underlined at the end on the bottom left-hand column of this of all of the discussion was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's word, in which he basically makes a similar point to the one we're making here, and he says this is ridiculous. You're not understanding. You're extrapolating from classic sources to this scenario is ridiculous. And this is underlined at the bottom. Vatan Oz Connectum Harab Yaakov Kamenetsky Zal. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said this is a whole. You're taking classic sources and misapplying them to modern scenarios. None of these calculations are right. The whole hachdin is the Pidyon Shavuim, that using the normal sukkahs of Pidyon Shavuim, lesser elo b'shas shalom, that's at a time of peace. Al b'shas milchama, at a time of war, you can't say that we are obligated to, that we have to stop fighting and redeem with money. We're helping the enemy in the middle of war. So what do you think is going to happen to your $1 million given to these hijackers? It's going to be used to create more war against the Jewish people and against Israel. So none of the cheshbonos of Pidyon Shavuim, the argument being put forward was, we saw sources that said, for Gadol Hadar, you can overpay. So Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner is a Gadol who has an enormous contribution to make to Klal Yisrael. So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, that's who was a close friend of Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner, so he wasn't immune to the personal pain. He said this is ridiculous. The idea that the regular formula of negotiating with hostage takers applies at a time of war, where you're feeding the enemy, that's clearly craziness. This, sadly, as we know, was also subject of debate at the time of the Second World War, and the idea of paying the Nazis to release trainers of Jews. Very, very painful and controversial debate at the time. And around there was also a distinction made between whether this was going to go to the war itself or whether this was just going to go to the personal pockets of the Nazis. So near the end of the war, the Nazis were trying to enrich themselves and were effectively taking bribes. It wasn't going to go to the war effort. It was going to be channeled away to bank accounts in Argentina, where they were hoping to set up a new life for themselves. And therefore, again, maybe the moral equation shifted a little bit. I simply want to conclude, though, this part of the discussion by saying that we're sitting here discussing, in a sense, an interesting halachic discourse about something that isn't just an interesting halachic discourse. It's obviously painful beyond painful. And therefore, as I said, I was initially somewhat reluctant to discuss it, but I think there's been so many conversations over the last week about what's going on in Israel with different stances put forward by different people. And on one hand, how can we not feel a simpler and relief that some of the hostages, the small number that Hamas is releasing, and how can we reject and turn away the families who are crying for their families to be released? On the other hand, concerns about, is this affecting Israel's military operation in delaying and so on? These questions are way above my pay grade, obviously, and way above, I have no insight into this. And as we saw, based upon Rav Hashkafic's quote from Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rav Shaul Yisraeli, Rav Yehuda Henkin, and so on, these are legitimate decisions for an elected government to make. And it would be inappropriate to use the sources of the Mishnah and Gittin and the Maram Rothenberg story and the like to paskin for the modern scenarios. So that really concludes the first part of what I wanted to look at this evening. I want to look at a second exceptionally painful subject. And again, I initially was not planning to speak about this, but it's become so spoken about in Israel that I'll share the topic with you. And this is the issue of soldiers giving conditional divorces. So the background to this is that a soldier may be killed in war, and if they have no children, then their spouse has to have yibum and chalitza, which is a very difficult process to go through. Effectively leaving the wife chained to the brother through the halachas of yibum, or they may be captured for a lengthy amount of time, or declared missing in action, leaving effectively their spouse in limbo, their wife in limbo, because it's not clear what's happened to them, and effectively a terrible igun may result. Now, again, this is a very painful topic, and there was a lot of discomfort initially in Israel speaking about this. Will even raising this question damage the morale of soldiers? And there were those that said this is wholly inappropriate subject, and as I said initially, I wasn't going to speak about this for that reason. And then others in Israel who said, look, soldiers aren't naive, they know what's going on, they want to make arrangements for their family. And in fact, it's a standard process in which soldiers write a will and make arrangements for, God forbid, bereavement. There should be any at all. So why can't this be a legitimate discussion about resolving this issue also? So again, I just want to share with you a brief some halachic sources around the subject. This is not a new topic. This is a very ancient one. In the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through the whole Gemara in source 1 on page 2. But basically, the Gemara says that, let's look at the critical lines, 3 lines up from the bottom of source 1. Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Omer Rabbi Yonasan. Any soldier who went out to wage war in the house of David, Kosid gets Krisos Lish, they used to write a get for their wife, and so on. So the Gemara there says that they used to write a divorce for their spouse, for their wife, before they went to battle. And Rashi there says, get Krisos al Tanai. It was I should have read the Gemara. They used to write a conditional get, that if they die, they will be divorced from now. So the background to this is as follows. We don't want to ask a soldier to divorce their wife before they go out to battle, because why should they divorce their wife? Why should they end the marriage? Hopefully they'll come back. Most soldiers come back perfectly safely, thank God, and please God that should be the case. So why should they make a divorce? Secondly, you can have kohanim who don't want to. It's not appropriate for them to divorce their wives. On the other hand, a divorce can't be conducted post-mortem. A divorce has to be in life. So Rashi suggests a model in which a get would be given now, conditional. And the condition would be if I don't reappear after 2 years, so 2 years after the war is over, let's say, if I still am missing in action, at that point, the divorce should be take effect from now, retroactively. So you can give a conditional divorce. If we have a look at source 2, source 2 at the top of page 3, in which the mission tells us you can do divorces conditionally. If someone says this should be your get after I die, it's irrelevant. There's no such thing as divorce post-death. But I want it to take effect now if I die. From now if I die, how is it get? Then this is a good get. So basically, a get, like any other legal arrangement, or like many other legal arrangements, can be done conditionally. So a get can be done in which a soldier declares, if I don't return after X amount of time, then the get should take effect. So this is the sort of halachic background to the context. Now, this sadly was discussed through the generations. And I printed here in source 4 some of the sources. In 1939, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, who would go on, of course, to become the chief rabbi of Israel, engaged in halachic discourse with Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, who was the senior halachic authority at the time. Of Herzog at the time was a younger scholar, but a very, very important one. And Chaim Ozer Grodzinski was the senior elder statesman of the Poskei Hadar. And they began exploring whether this was appropriate for people to do. Unfortunately, in 1939, there were Jews serving in the British Army. America wasn't yet in the war. Jews serving in the Polish Army, Jews serving in the Russian Army, and also, unfortunately, increasing arrests of Jews by ever increasingly anti-Semitic governments in Germany and Austria and the like. And therefore, maybe it made sense for people to embark on such a get. Reb Isaac Halevi was skeptical about the concept of giving a conditional get. He said there's a number of logistical challenges to do so, including exactly how to phrase the conditions, and you increase the complications of what's anyway a fairly difficult process by doing such a conditional get. And he proposed an alternative model in which, rather than a conditional get being given, rather than that, people should appoint agents. They should declare, if I appoint someone an agent to give my wife a get, and this get should be effective if I haven't turned up within 2 years. And the nature of the get would be, rather than conditional in that sense of taking place from now, it would be if I have disappeared in 2 years' time, then either I am tragically dead, in which case my wife is free, or the get would take effect, and then they would be freed. Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, and I've been to the sources here, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into them fully. He believed that the classic model of a conditional get was still applicable. And he says here in Vilna, we are arranging Gittin al Tanai. And again, this is just a profoundly sad phenomena of those years. And there was some discussion around this. There are, however, halachic complications with this, which reflect the differing nature of warfare and of modern warfare. And Rabbi Isaac Halevi was conscious of this. And he said the last time this was discussed extensively in halachic literature was in the Russo-Japanese War of 1906. And he said at the time then someone would go off to war and not come home the whole time they were in the army until they were released, and then they would come home. So he says there conditional get can work. He says in more modern warfare, like 1939, people do a turn of duty, then they come home and they're released, certainly if they're British Army. And then they go out to warfare and then come back, and then go out to warfare and then come back. And he says, I don't believe in such a case a conditional get can easily be done, because two things are going to happen. Number one, when the soldier returns, they're going to go back home to their spouse and effectively nullify the get. They don't want the get to be active, and they're effectively cancelling this conditional arrangement that's being made. Secondly, if the get does remain in effect conditionally, and in the end the get is activated, it turns out they were living in sin retroactively because they arranged this get at the time having it conditionally. And therefore, Isaac Halevi Herzog, and in more recent years, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, and so on, said they don't believe in modern warfare these conditional gittin are effective. Because soldiers do a turn of duty, then they're released, they go back home, then they do another turn of duty, and then they go back home. And in going back home, one or two things is happening. Either they're effectively saying we don't want the get to take effect, in which case it's a cancellation of the appointment of the agent or cancellation of the get, or if the get remains valid and will work retroactively, it turns out retroactively this was living in sin. I want to conclude simply with 2 points of interest, and I hope one of chizuk. And that's on page 4. I put a photocopy of a Basin issued by the London Basin, by the Court of the Chief Rabbi, under, I believe, the stewardship of Rechatzkel Abramsky at the time, prepared for British soldiers, based basically, as far as I can tell, on the Rav Isaac Halevi Herzog model. And for those who are interested in perusing this, you can have a look at that. I don't know if people are aware of this, but these were done by Jewish British soldiers at the time, based upon the model that was put forward. The final point I just want to conclude, in a sense, in a note of chizuk, is that Baruch Hashem, Israel has never actually had an unresolved aguna issue with soldiers, and Chastei Hashem, casualties in Israel's wars have been low, and even though every death is a terrible tragedy, and there has not ever been a live case of Igun, Baruch Hashem, in Israel's army, and therefore the poskim that are looking at this now in modern day Israel are saying there are a number of halachic complications. This formula of a conditional get doesn't easily cross-translate to modern day army warfare, as we said, where soldiers go home and come back and go home and come back. Unlike the war of David HaMelech, where people stayed away the whole time, and unlike the Russo-Japanese war in 1906, by 1939 situations had already changed. And finally, they say, why should we start this morale damaging conversation when Baruch Hashem there haven't been cases of Igun in Israel's wars? So there hasn't been large-scale application of this process. Interestingly, Rav Chaim Zobin brings that in Vilna, he says also then uptake was very low. People didn't choose to take advantage of this halachic formula he has established. Yes.
And the last paragraph refers to the soldiers coming home and leaving.
Yes.
He's picked that point up.
Yes, they have. They've picked up that point that it shouldn't. I'm not entirely clear whether this was actions or not. I need to do further research. But yes, he puts this point in order to avoid cancellation of it. Again, Rav Isaac Halevi talks about this, and Rabbi Halevi Herzog speaks about this, and other ideas. But I would point out that it can end up as that in effect, if you basically speaking, the challenge is to have a model which isn't cancelled by return, and which doesn't have the problem of retroactive a divorce, in which case it turns out that even when the soldier came home, they were living together in sin. That's the challenge of the model. And the consensus amongst poskim is that with modern warfare, that this isn't really a viable solution. But this is an example of what a model might look like. Right, which also isn't feasible to rewrite it consistently. I could have mentioned that also. Rabbi Zobin in his letter to Rabbi Moshe, he says there's another problem with this conditional get, that we simply don't have the resources. So many people are being called up. We don't have the resources, and we need a pro forma. This version printed on the back is a pro forma, whereas writing a full get is a very laborious and complicated process. We simply don't have the means to issue conditional getting on behalf of everyone, and therefore that's another reason why he preferred this appointment of agency, which is agency appointment, which is what the formula at the back is. Either way, if you're interested, you can read the Hebrew inside, in which Isaac Levi speaks explicitly about this, or basically the English is more or less in line with his halachic formula. So I think with this, we'll finish our series on ethics and morals of war. For those who didn't hear the audio show, and they're all online, so there's something to listen to. And again, everything we've discussed today is obviously not easily translatable to the current situation, and I certainly wasn't even begin voicing an opinion about what's gone on in Israel, and it would be heartless and cruel to do so when there's families who are suffering and by definition just in the deepest despair and agony about their relatives. So this is not an attempt to do that, but it's just, I think, important nonetheless to see some of the sources around how these issues are resolved. And Amir Hashem, I should never have to engage with these topics again. Please God, we should never have to have shurim around this, and there should only be shalom for the whole world. Amen.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.